looking back, it seems to have started about 8 or 9 years ago. And after 4 years of work, there was a draft of Part 101. There was even a draft of Part 102, but there was no consensus. I think people decided it was too difficult. We'll just stop on this, and maybe we'll just have to carry on as we are. But the end users, so back to our highways engineers, and particularly people at TfL at the time, said, no, you have got to sort it.
Bringing you the stories behind the standards. This is the BSI Education Podcast with Matthew Childs and Cindy Paragill. Today's episode is on standards and pavements.
Hello, my name is Matthew Childs and I am with
Cindy Paragill.
Cindy, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Matthew. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Now, the aim of this podcast is to bring you the stories behind the standards. Back in episode 24 of the podcast, still available on the feed, we looked at standards and potholes and the standard BS 10947 for spray injection patching. Now, today's episode is on a similar theme. We move from potholes to pavements and the standard BS 7533-101. Pavements constructed with clay, concrete or natural stone, which is being published this month, the first in a series of standards in this area. I don't know about you, Cindy, but when I hear potholes to pavements, my mind jumps immediately to Heaven 17's 1981 debut album, Penthouse and Pavement. You?
Nope.
Okay then, one for all you new romantics out there instead. Now, it's worth saying that the potholes episode wasn't really just about the potholes. It was about how new technologies, in that case spray injection patching, can be incorporated into standards. And in a similar way, this episode isn't really just about pavements either. It's more about the patience, perseverance and the power of consensus in standards making. Now, to help us take this little walk on the wilder side of standards making, we speak to Richard Scrivener and Tim Yates, two of the standards makers involved in the development of BS 7533-101. You heard a snippet of Tim at the top of the episode, talking about how the influence of the end users of the standard have been instrumental in restarting the standards making process that at that stage had completely stalled. We should also thank BSI's Gavin Jones too for his help in developing this episode.
Matthew, I think at this point we should also probably explain what we mean by pavements here. Now, this is from the Institution of Civil Engineering. In everyday English, pavements mean the footpath at the side of a road. In engineering terms, a pavement means a man-made surface on natural ground that people, vehicles, or animals can cross. So any ground surface prepared for transport counts as pavement. A pavement is a sequence or a set of layers of materials placed on the natural ground. Pavement engineering is a branch of civil engineering. It involves knowledge of soils, hydraulics, and other materials, and how these materials react to load or weight.
And a road then?
A road is a type of pavement.
Okay, and what we think of pavements are what?
That's a footway.
Not a footpath?
Let's not go there.
Good point. We should probably just walk on. Now, also in this episode, we have the Standards Desk of News and the latest of our My Favourite Standard. This time we hear from BSI's Sadie Dainton talking about why ISO 26000 for social responsibility is important to her. But before we get going proper, a reminder that for more information on BSI education, go to bsigroup.com/education. Do please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts and share us on social media using the hashtag BSIEdPod. And if you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, or even ideas for future episodes, then do please get in touch at education@bsigroup.com. We really welcome your feedback.
Do you want to know more about the role and purpose of standards in the modern world? Then BSI's free online course, The Power of Standards, is for you. Through its 3 modules, you'll learn about what standards are, why organizations use them, how they are made, and how and why people get involved in standards making. The course is designed to last around 30 minutes, but you don't need to complete it all at once. You can stop at any point and restart again later when you're ready. To find out more, visit bsigroup.com/education.
So we start our story of pavements, patience, perseverance, and the power of consensus with Richard Scrivener. Richard is a senior engineer with the design and engineering firm Arup and is currently working on a range of transport and development projects throughout the UK. He is also a standards maker, being a member of BSI Committee B507 on paving units and curbs. I spoke to Richard about what the standard BS 7533-101 is all about, the role he played in its development, and what difference he thinks it will make for engineers. He also sets us straight about the engineering definitions of roads, pavements, and footways. But I started by asking him about his standards journey.
Yeah, well, I guess the first time I was introduced to British standards would have been back at university. I was studying civil engineering, and we were given British standards to aid in our structural and geotechnical designs at the time, and they were very different to sort of textbooks we've been familiar with as students back in primary school and secondary school. They were very procedural, very different in their style. And at that point, I probably viewed them as some sort of sacred term, which had some innate truth to them, which sort of just had to be followed. And it was like, this is engineering. A lot of them were quite thick, and for the purposes of our studies, we'd often take little snippets out and use what we needed to know. It wasn't until I graduated that I began to use British standards more in the fields of highway and drainage engineering. Used a lot more documents and read the documents more thoroughly. And then I found that they aren't static documents. They are evolving documents. They're not perfect. They're sometimes very old. They don't always reflect current technologies. So they develop over time. And as I used the documents, I had these little discoveries of gaps that I found within the standards. And that led to discussions with colleagues and suppliers, landscape architects and other designers, until I found myself discussing them with people who form part of the groups that wrote the standards. And lo and behold, I discovered that they weren't sort of sacred terms handed down from boffins at the top level. They were written by people like me who work in the industry and have other jobs. It's not a full-time profession to write standards for the people who wrote them. So I began to get more and more involved in discussions about how they were written, and that led me to ultimately become involved in writing British standards. They're not written by the British Standard institutions themselves, but by people who sit on committees working within the profession.
It's often described that BSI holds the pen, and then obviously the standards are developed by stakeholders, although pen seems an old-fashioned term now. Now, I want to come back to your role as a standards maker in a moment, but tell us, what is this particular standard all about and why is it important?
Yeah, so BS 7533, which is the standard I've been involved in developing for the last number of years, it's all about modular pavements. And by pavement, as a highway engineer, we don't mean the bit at the side of the road that you walk on. We refer to that as a footway. A pavement includes any engineered structure that takes traffic. So that can be pedestrian foot traffic or vehicular traffic. And by modular, we mean simply not continuous, like asphalt or concrete pavements, but it's made up of discrete elements which collectively come together to form a durable and often aesthetically pleasing surface for foot traffic or vehicular traffic. Most modular pavements have existed in some form since back to about 4000 BC. The earliest sort of footpaths that were used just to make a more durable surface to walk on, an aesthetic surface. And many of the engineered roads first built in the UK by the Romans were all of modular construction as well. The main reason for this, aside from the fact that we didn't have the modern day materials and technologies, was that it's a lot easier to transport and assemble small pieces together on site to form a coherent structure, rather than trying to build a single sort of monolithic length of road. So modular pavements is a subset of pavement engineering, and BS 7533 is the general sort of authority on how to design them and how to build them. Nowadays, you'll struggle to venture into any urban area without coming across modular paving, be that concrete flags or stone slabs on a footway, concrete blocks or stone sets in a pedestrianised street, or just concrete curbs at the edge of a road, which are also covered under BS 7533. So it's a standard that it permeates through pretty much every aspect of the urban environment. So you can imagine it's quite important that we get this right, and that we design pavements and curbing in a way that's going to be safe, durable and sustainable.
So as a non-engineer then, Richard, just so I've got this straight, we've got roads, pavements and footways, and what we're talking about here is this is a standard for sort of pedestrianised roads. Would that be right?
Partly right. I'd say the road and the footpath or the footway. So footway is the bit at the side of the road that you walk on. The road is the bit that vehicles drive on. The pavement is the bit beneath, effectively the build-up of materials which form the durable surface on which you either walk on or you drive on. So modular pavement, it's modular in construction, but the pavement can be under a footway, it can be under the road, or it could even be a garden path or a patio. Anything that you walk or drive on that's made of small elements of concrete, stone, or clay.
Okay, so back to the standard itself. Then I'm interested as an engineer and working as a standards maker. What role did you play, and who else was involved in terms of developing the standard?
Yeah, so I'll take you back to where I first got involved, which was the standard. As I say, it permeates through all of the built environment. Being a highway engineer, I inevitably used it on most of the projects I worked on. After graduating from highway schemes to commercial developments and small-scale developments. And in 2015, 2016, I was given the opportunity to lead the civil engineering design for a £25 million redevelopment of the city of Hull, which is my hometown, as part of the build-up to the City of Culture, which Hull hosted in 2017. So that project was refurbishment of the city centre, and it involved pretty much all of the possible variants of paving that you can ever think of. So concrete flags, stone slabs, blocks, sets and clay pavers, which are all the different sizes and variants of the materials that are covered by the standards, as well as curbing, and even reclaimed cobbles, which are a subset of stone paving. Even had a couple of water features paved with modular paving. So it was a really good chance to sort of thoroughly investigate the standards and use all the different bits of them, and then put it into practice on a major project to draw out, I guess, some of the inconsistencies and the shortcomings. The standards, they didn't cover all of the eventualities and all of the materials, and the traffic loading is only a limited subset of what's possible. The biggest gripe I found using 7533 in its previous form was that there was simply too many documents to get a handle with as a design engineer. The former suite of 7533 documents are split into 12 parts. 6 of them covered design, 5 of them covered construction and materials, and there was one covering maintenance. So it was quite unwieldy to use as a designer, and you'd often find when you're looking at 2 very similar materials, you would end up with very different designs for the pavement. It was these discussions that led me to ultimately join British Standards Committee B507 after discussing the standards with people on the committee. And upon joining the committee, I discovered that I was already familiar with many of the bodies represented on the committee. So each person on the committee represents a professional association. So there's Interpave, the Precast Concrete Paving Trade Association, the Stone Federation, that represents stone paving manufacturers, and professional institutions such as the Institute of Civil Engineers, which I'm also a member of. So I joined as member and representative of the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transport, the CIHT, which I'm also a member of. And I really sought to try and bring a designer's perspective to the committee, which at the time included a lot of representatives of suppliers and manufacturers, but not too many people like me, I guess, who use them day in, day out and find all the sort of nuances and sort of creeps in the standards which we'd like to sort of resolve in the future issues.
Now, you mentioned there, Richard, the BSI Committee B507, which covers, amongst other standards, this particular one we're talking about today, BS 7533. Now, we love having standards makers on the podcast because we always like to we want to get an insight into the sort of conversations and debates that take place within standards making. So take us inside some of the conversations and debates and challenges for this particular standard.
The biggest challenge for me in the development of 7533-101 was to try and bring together several standards from the previous suite into a single, concise, consistent and coherent document that, as a designer, I could quickly pick up, refer to, find the bits that I needed to use to produce a design, and know that I've got the right answer. So from a designer's perspective, firstly, I could see no reason why blocks, sets, and clay pavers, which are the sort of small elements of paving, which all act predominantly in compression, couldn't be designed as a single design method, and why concrete flags and slabs, which are the sort of larger paving units, large and thin, which generally fail by bending and cracking, why they couldn't be designed into a single approach as well. So I saw the materials that were being used effectively as sort of elements of matter that acted in the same way and therefore could be designed the same way.
So how about your sort of primary focus then, your primary contribution to the work of the committee on this standard?
My primary focus was to gather all of the documents that were previously circulating and pull them together into a single, concise, coherent document that I could pick up as a designer and use quickly on a project to get the answer that I was looking for. However, when I joined the committee as a drafting panel member, it was clear that the working draft that was being worked on was more of a concatenation of the documents than a combination of the previous 5 standards. And I knew that was some issues to resolve when I did a quick word count on the working draft and found that the new standard was longer than all of the previous standards combined. So as a designer, I wanted to really make sure that we could condense it down to be as concise as it could be, so that people like me could quickly get to the information they need, still read through the information that is useful but isn't necessarily referred to every time you do a design. From a designer, I looked at the sections that were in there, and there was lots of repetition for the different materials. And as a designer, I couldn't see a reason why elements of concrete, clay, and stone, which were the same size, couldn't be effectively designed using the same design methods. Small elements generally act in compression, whereas the larger ones tend to bend more, which causes them to crack. But ultimately, they're units of matter, which I thought could act in the same way. Now, that turned out to be a bit of an oversimplification, and I'll be the first to admit that my own knowledge of the properties of stone and concrete have developed since joining the committee, so that was a good exercise for me. But for example, concrete is manufactured under controlled factory conditions, whereas stone is subject to natural variations such as bedding planes. Concrete has a fairly rough finish surface, whereas sawn stone units can be relatively smooth, which affects the frictional interlock between the units. And even different types of stone from different geologies, so your metamorphic, your igneous, your sedimentary, can have pretty significant variations in the water absorption rates and the skid resistance. So there does need to be some variation in the methods. So my focus was therefore to look at all of these different factions of concrete, clay, and stone, try to pick out the common ground between them and the similarities in order to bring the size of the standard down to something that'd be more agile to use as a designer, but still encompassed all of the variations between the materials and made sure that we didn't oversimplify too much to the point where we were either over conservative or we started to miss possible design scenarios out.
Richard, I'll ask you in a second about the sort of difference you think the standard will make to you and other engineers in your industry. But just picking up there on what you said about the learning experience for you. So how did you find that as an engineer, a chartered engineer, a huge amount of experience, bringing your expertise to the conversation. You obviously took away some learnings as well. So what was it like having to debate and discuss with other engineers, coming at things with a different perspective?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I guess surprised me but pleased me on joining the panel. You're sat in a room with all these people with vast experience, but all representing different interests and different fields. So as I said, I was coming from a design perspective as a designer from a design consultancy where I use the standards, but there were different people representing trade bodies for manufacturers, so the people who make the units, who are very clued up on the stone or the concrete or mortars, which use as a bedding material. There's landscape architects on there. And all of these people come together with their different views and different takes on the standard. They all use the standard in different ways, and they're all interested in different parts of the standard. So it really does give you an increased knowledge of, and I guess an empathy for the way people see the standards. As a designer, I'm only interested in certain aspects to get my design done, to get the project delivered. But small properties of materials which were in the standard were some of the, I guess, the most contentious issues that were debated, which for me as a designer, as long as the mortar or the stone meets the specification requirements, then I'm happy. As to where those requirements come from, as a designer, as long as you've got confidence in the standard, you don't really need to consider them too much. But there were members on the panel which obviously have a very keen interest because it's what they do. They make these materials and they know them inside out. So they were very focused on particular areas, which has a big influence on the standard. But they were less concerned with other areas, such as, for example, foundation design, where the manufacturer of a stone paving unit doesn't necessarily need to know or get involved in that side of design. But as a highway engineer, I'm very interested in the foundation because it makes sure that our pavement is durable and is going to last the intended life. So it really does give you that perspective of all the different people coming into design a standard, and it greatly increases your knowledge, not only of the standard development process, but the different aspects of engineering.
Yes, and I suppose ultimately the power of this, all those different perspectives coming together and creating that consensus, is that you produce a better standard at the end of the day, which I think obviously is really, really important. Now, we talk in the standards world about standards providing solutions to problems. So I wonder, firstly, what difference will the standard make to you as an engineer and other engineers in your industry?
The new version of 7533-101, which covers all of the design elements from the previous design suites, gives greater confidence in the design and specification of modular pavements for a greater range of materials and a wider spectrum of traffic loading. It makes it easier for the designer to design a pavement if they know that what they want to design is covered under the standard and there aren't any areas for ambiguity where they have to make an engineering judgment. This British standard is a best practice document, so it's a guide to designing pavements. The new standard covers slightly higher traffic loading than previous and goes right down to the domestic patio situations. So it's got a range of design possibilities, and it also minimises the gaps and inconsistencies that previously occurred between paving units and where there were different dimensional limits. So between a concrete flag and a concrete block, for example, there's always been this bit of a grey area. So we've tried to reduce as much as possible any inconsistencies or ambiguity that can come throughout that. And ultimately that should mean that we've got more efficient and safer designs, and we don't have to build in conservatism where we think there might be an area that falls outside of the standard.
Are you a postgraduate studying at a UK university? Do you have a research idea or project that involves standards in some way? Well, if so, BSI Student Research Program can help. The way it works is simple. We gain valuable information about an area of interest to our standards work, while you can benefit from mentorship to support your project and the chance to gain knowledge and exposure that may increase your future employability. To find out more about the program, including case studies of previously supported projects and how to apply, visit bsigroup.com pavements.org/education.
Cindy, it's that time in the episode. Shall we have the Standards Desk of News?
Yep, let's do it. Fitness test for health apps.
From COVID-19 to counting calories, there are hundreds of thousands of health and wellness apps on the market. However, many have access to highly sensitive personal information, whilst others may offer advice that is not always supported by scientific evidence. In order to evaluate the quality and reliability of such apps effectively, a new technical specification has been published. ISO TS 82304-2 brings together guidelines and requirements for apps by many local and national health organisations around the world to ensure they are safe, reliable and effective. May the 4th be with you.
In the UK, the National Quality Infrastructure Partners, BSI, the National Physical Laboratory, and the UK Accreditation Service, with the UK government, has recently published the action plan, Standards for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, designed to unlock the value of standards for innovation and technological change. The plan's 6 actions include accelerating the digitalization of standards to foster the industries of the future and embedding the consideration of standards in the public policy making process. Finally, the nominations are...
Nominations are open for the 2021 BSI Standards Awards, the annual celebration of standards. There are 2 different types of awards, one for standards makers and one for standards users, with a number of different categories for each, including for education, which is for universities who've successfully integrated standards into their degree programmes. To find out more about the awards and how to make a nomination, go to bsigroup.com/standards awards. And that's the Standards Desk of News.
My favourite standard.
Hi, my name's Sadie Dainton, Consumer Policy Manager at BSI. Now, because I've spent a long and very enjoyable time in the world of standards, I've really found it quite hard to pick a favourite. I could have chosen second-hand goods, as that was a project started between consumer organisations and the Caribbean countries. Or maybe energy service to users, because that was the first standard initiated by Consumers International. But really, I think it has to be ISO 26000, Social Responsibility. This is a standard for organisations committed to operating in a socially responsible way. It provides guidance to those who recognise that respect for society and the environment is a critical success factor. Now, one of the reasons I've chosen it is because it took a really, really long time to get published. It first emerged as a concept from a Capolco workshop back in 2001, and it was actually only published in 2010, and that included 5 years of global negotiation between up to 500 stakeholders. But I suppose the other reason, and something I'm particularly proud of, is the fact that out of those organisations, 80 of them were consumer organisations. The biggest representation of consumer organisations in any international standard. And I think what the development process for ISO 26000 demonstrates is the importance of all those different stakeholders, government, industry, NGOs, labour and consumers. That it's really important to bring all of those together to create that global consensus. And because of that really strong consumer voice in the development of ISO 26000, it has placed responding to the needs of consumers front and centre of what it means to be a socially responsible organisation. So for me, it has to be ISO 26000. That's my favourite standard.
We pick up our pavements story with Tim Yates. Tim has been involved in work related to buildings and structures for more than 40 years. He serves on a number of SEN and BSI standards committees, including B507 for paving units and curbs. He is currently head of the European unit that provides specialist technical support on the construction products regulation to the UK government and the European Commission. And he's also technical director at the BRE Group, responsible for the management of projects relating to heritage, stone, and other traditional building materials. Now, if Richard brought us the latest developments of the standard BS 7533-101, with Tim, we take a step back into the history of the standard. We hear from Tim about the challenges involved in reaching consensus and how those challenges were overcome, including his own role in helping to kickstart a standards-making process that had come to a complete halt. And also his thoughts on some of the positive impacts that lockdown and the subsequent move to online working has had on the standards development process. But we start with Tim telling us about his own standards journey.
It's been a very long journey. I think we we were part of the government when I first went to building research back in the 80s, and we provided technical support on behalf of the government to a lot of standards, both British and international. And after I'd been at BRE a few years, somebody said, could you just pop along to a couple of meetings to finish off some European standards? So I actually started with SEN European standards, which gave me a place on a British Standards Mirror Committee. And that was back in 1992. So coming up for a long period. I think I may have had a very early meeting even in 1991. So I started very much on SEN and on test methods was my area. And after I'd done that for 2 or 3 years, I'd obviously either done something wrong or something right and got asked to join and as convener of another SEN committee and to take that on. And that was actually linked to this work in that it was the European standard for the surfacing materials, the concrete, clay and stone that forms the top layer in our pavements and our roadways that this standard is very much about. And I've continued with that. It did turn out to be slightly more than 2 or 3 meetings. It's now kind of passed into 200 or 300 meetings, but I've continued. And I guess where I now, I chair 2 BSI committees, one on policy and one on heritage, and also very much just taken on a chairmanship of the European standards one. So I'm continuing, not intending to continue forever, but been a long journey, very interesting, met a lot of great people across Europe, and become more and more involved, I guess, in BSI standards and writing them probably over the last 20 years. Maybe not quite as long as some of the European ones.
Actually, that sounds fantastic. Actually, I just wanted before you move on, I just wanted to ask you there, with your sort of 20 plus years as a standards maker, what difference has that made to your career? What influence has it had?
It's taken me on quite a long journey, actually, because having worked and continued to work in standards, it took me in 2 directions. One, I became involved with the Stone Federation, which is the trade association of the stone industry in Great Britain, and became president of that, which was a great honour. So working with all aspects of the industry, from producers, sellers, installers. And it also took me into European work, into European regulations, and I still work, even after Brexit, I still work for the Commission, providing technical support related to construction products. And at the Commission, I'm seen as quite an oddity in that I work on regulations and for them, but I'm also experienced in writing standards and in the industry as working with SMEs. So that kind of initial thing, would you like to go along to 2 or 3 meetings, has taken me some very interesting places and given me a very wide understanding of the whole process. Where is the standard going to go? What is it going to do? What's its origin? How does it relate to regulations, to health and safety? And how does that then impinge on people in their everyday lives? Particularly perhaps when they get the wrong materials or the wrong standards used. And I guess the ultimate, it takes me into expert work, giving evidence, usually in civil cases, but occasionally in criminal cases, to do with standards, and having that background in writing them and working with people who write them gives you a good understanding of what was the intent of that standard when it was written. What did people think it was going to mean and going to do, and how does that then influence when something's gone wrong?
Now, it sounds to me then you've had a fantastically positive experience of standards making. You know, you were dragged into those couple of meetings, and it's become 20 years of part of your career. I just wonder if you were to put yourself in the position of maybe a young engineer or any professional background. Really, you're 21 years old, and you've been invited to go along to a particular meeting. What would you say to that person?
I would say take the opportunity. Don't be daunted by the old people who are there, who, like me now, say we've been here for 30 years, we've seen it all, and it's all changed. Don't be daunted. Don't be afraid to ask if you don't know. And I learned that very early on. You can't bluff your way through with these people who really, really do know their stuff. They live and die their products and their technical knowledge, and it's something. It was quite easy for me because we were actually paid by government to provide representation at that time, back in the 90s. Much harder if you come from an industry side for people to see, well, what is the value? And it is, I know it's a concern for our committees and for BSI more generally, and across Europe, I hear the same. We've all grown old, and we need a new generation to come and to learn and to take that on, and to understand that standards are important. They ultimately save lives, and they create sustainable solutions, and it really is an important aspect of the work. But if invited, take the opportunity and go for it.
Fantastic advice there, Tim. Now, I've asked you on to talk about a particular standard, BS 7753-101. I'd just like you to sort of take us inside the process for this. I'm interested about the development of this standard, to sort of take us back in time a bit. You know, what were the drivers for the review of this standard? You know, paint the picture for us.
So I think looking back, the standards 7533 started as just one or two parts. About 20 years ago, it looks like, maybe a little bit more, 25 years ago. And over time, people said, it would be good if we had a standard that covered the design of a heavily trafficked pavement, or a pavement created out of slabs, or maybe out of blocks, or maybe something for the reinstatement. And over time, it evolved all the way until there were 13 parts to it. And I think some 7 or 8 years ago, that the end users, so that's the highways engineers, the landscapers, hard landscape designers, transport providers, so Transport for London and people like that, found this just too confusing. There were 13 parts. They covered all of the design and all of the installation of a whole range of materials, but they never knew from one day to the next which one they need to be picking up. And I think that the message eventually got back to those involved, particularly on the material side, that this isn't working. In fact, they were really quite blunt about it, I think. They just said it was hopeless, that they couldn't make any sense out of all these parts. Do you go to part 1 or part 6, and do you go to then part 8 or part 9? And they just wanted a solution which was 2 parts. They wanted one part which covered all the design, and one that covered all of the installation. They didn't mind. They worked across a range of materials, a range of traffic categories, a range of end users. They just wanted some really nice, clear guidance. And I think everyone said, yes, that'll be straightforward. We'll do that. But it proved to be a bit more challenging than that.
And can you tell us about those specific challenges? But obviously, at the heart of standards, it's about developing consensus and avoiding disagreement. about what needs to be done. So take us inside and identify for us some of those specific challenges for developing that consensus for this particular standard.
Having given some thought to the question, it was it's interesting. If I go back to the SEN product standards where I started out, and the test methods, if I'm writing a product standard for a clay paver, so that's one of our products, all of the people involved in writing it produce clay pavers. They might be importers, they might sell them, but they're all kind of focused on one product, and that's their. When they wake up in the morning, they want to talk about clay pavers, and when they go to bed at night, they probably dream of clay pavers, and the same for other ones, whether it was concrete or stone. But it does make it quite straightforward. I have a product. I've got a set of international regulations and requirements which could apply to it, and I write a standard around that. If I then move on and say, well, I'm going to do the installation of it, the design and installation of it, if it's a single product, and I've had a lot of involvement in natural stone cladding and lining for the exteriors of buildings, again, I'm quite focused. I've got one product sector, and might install it in different ways, but we're all generally going in the same direction. Then suddenly you come to 7533, and I've got 4 major product groups involved. So I've got the natural stone, I've got the clay industry, I've got the concrete industry, and I've got the mortar industry, which I think people had perhaps overlooked, that in making roadways, pavements, patios, whatever it is, work, that the bits that go with it, that hold it together or hold it apart, are really important. And I think that was the challenge for this product, was that we had 4 product kind of sectors, as well as the end users, the engineers, each of whom were hugely passionate about their area, and rightly committed to promoting it and making it best practice for it, and doing it in the right way. But I think that was the challenge, was not bringing 4 producers of stone to consensus, but bringing many, many different producers and suppliers from 4 very different and often competing product areas. Sometimes it will be a case, it might be clay, it might be stone, it might be concrete. And sometimes they will be competing, and all of them, quite rightly, want to do their best for their industry. So it's pulling those groups together, I think, is where the real challenge lay with this standard.
So with these particular groups, we've got broadly four groups, all coming at it from their different perspectives, obviously passionate about pavements in their own way. How long has that process taken then from, we're going to review the standard, and although the standard hasn't been published yet, we're kind of near publication. Tell us about how long has that process taken to develop that consensus?
So looking back, it seems to have started about 8 or 9 years ago. And after 4 years of work, there was a draft of Part 101. There was even a draft of Part 102, but there was no consensus. There was just no agreement, and it just stopped, basically. I think people decided it was too difficult. We'll just stop on this, and maybe we'll just have to carry on as we are. But the end users, so back to our highways engineers and to Richard, who I know you is involved in recording as well. It's people at TfL, and particularly people at TfL at the time, said, no, you have got to sort it. We want to use these products. It's really important for us, but we need the design and installation guidance. And so 4 and a bit years ago, I was asked, would I take it on as to lead what was just a working group then, and eventually became the panel. And I think I was asked because most people knew me, because I'd been around a long time. They also knew, although I was president of the Stone Federation at the time, that I did understand the other product group, because I'd worked with them across Europe and on many other areas. and so it was restarted. And interesting, we started with quite a small group to really see. I think it was just 6 of us at the first meeting, but with representatives from each of the 4 product groups. Do we have a chance of actually reaching consensus? And interestingly, at almost every meeting that we held, I started with the question, is there anything fundamental that is going to stop us reaching the end? And it was always interesting. People would always think and say, no, there isn't. And then we would discuss something for 6 hours that seemed fairly fundamental. But that was, I think that was where it kind of restarted, and how we began to move forward with things.
So you needed you needed someone to say, come on, we need to get this sorted, because there's a user need. So you had a user need there where so someone said, look, we really need to resolve this. I just wonder, obviously given your role as a standards maker and your experience, but I just wonder what you learned during that process. What were you thinking, well, this is the first time this has happened to this extent, and how did you approach that problem?
I knew when I took it on that it was a problem. I'm not sure I kind of perhaps took on board exactly how entrenched some of the positions were, and that it was quite difficult. But I did know all of the people involved, and had known quite a few of them for many years. And had worked with them on other projects, maybe not all together, but at various different times. And we just kind of started to explore and see if we would be able to move forward. But it wasn't an easy process. So I think I was there as a combination of facilitator, peacemaker, the person who occasionally had to bang the table to say, well, we need to move forward. And people are very good at looking back, often back to their positions. But the group got bigger as more people were drawn in. So more end users who were absolutely key. The landscapers, the hard landscapers, the road builders, the highways engineers, absolutely key, because they would look through a draft and say, this is better than before, but it's still not good enough for what we want. And I think the product producers and suppliers listen to those people, because in the end, if the end user wouldn't buy their products in any form, any of the products, they would go for a completely different solution. That wasn't going to do anything. And if they needed something in a particular way, then that was a good driver for it.
So I'm interested in what you say there. You had that sort of core group, and as maybe the sort of wider community realised, well, there's momentum here, there's going to be a solution, then it encouraged them to get involved. Is that how you felt it happened?
I think some got involved because they just felt they needed to be there in case something went wrong. And some people had very little to actually say in the meetings, but which was quite interesting. But they would come back afterwards and say, we didn't agree with this, or we think this would be better, or could you look at this, or here's some background. So they were almost silent partners, but within the process contributing to it. And eventually, so there were various things. We tried to put as much common material into the standard as possible, so that it didn't cover the design of foundations for stone and for clay and for concrete separately. They were in together. So at one time we pushed it all together, and people said, no, that's too far. So we pulled various bits apart and had a much less unified approach. And people said, no, that's not, that's going too far the other way. And just came down to a point where we could move forward together on some bits and keep other bits apart. But I'm not quite sure what happened. It was interesting because although a lot of the process took place during lockdown, so a lot of the meetings and then the final drafts and everything and all the comments resolution were all done virtually online, I think it gave a certain momentum. People could could say, oh, we'll meet for 2 hours. It's if you were going to meet face to face, it would take you a whole day. But people would say, we'll meet. And we got some real momentum. And instead of something perhaps taking 3 months, somebody saying, I've drafted this, and then we look at it and you meet 3 months later and people say they don't like it. It was a week later.
That's interesting. So you said you started sort of 4 years ago on this particular, really sort of started proper 4 years ago, but things have accelerated during lockdown because of the online process. I want to ask you about that in a second, but before I do, give us a sense of how many sort of drafts do you go through? So sort of from 4 years ago until the final standard, how many drafts has it gone through?
No real feel on that one. Maybe
I'm just interested if it's
maybe
20 or 20. And is
20.
that unusual for a stand in your experience as a standards maker? Is 20 a high number?
I would have said yes.
So just
but I think it reflected this kind of bringing everything. Well, what should we cover and how should we cover it, and then bringing it all together, and then kind of pulling it apart again, and then edging it back towards being together. I would think maybe 20 not complete rewrites, but pretty big differences.
And obviously, the entire standards world has moved online during the pandemic, so pretty much for 18 months now. And I was fascinated what you said there about the being online allowed the process to be slightly more agile, and you could have meetings arranged a bit more quickly. I also wonder whether did it allow people to get involved probably in a way they wouldn't have done, sort of a wider community of interest, a wider group of stakeholders was able to comment on those drafts because the process had gone online?
I would say for sure, yeah. So some of the more silent partners on the committee would have struggled to justify coming for travelling to London for a meeting. Although we did meet in other places. We met in Leicester and the BRE and various other locations. But people would always be thinking, I've got to go, I need to get back on the motorway, I need to drive back. And I think it did. You would get more people and more involvement. And easier for so one of the big people involved is based in Germany, but he could then attend every meeting because it was no more difficult for him to join than anyone else. And you got people from based out in Northern Ireland and things would all be able to join very easily. And you could also have sub-meetings. So 3 people would say, well, we will meet online and discuss this one paragraph and sort it out. Or somebody would write an annex, and those involved would just meet to answer particular questions. So a lot more momentum, a lot easier to keep going, a lot harder to control occasionally. I did tell them that the real problem is you can't bang the table when you're on a virtual meeting.
This is true. I just wonder, given your sort of 20, 30 year experience, I just wonder what, did you enjoy the experience more? Or was that, did it make it more, I won't say enjoyable, but more manageable, but more productive over the last 18 months because of the situation we were all facing?
I would definitely say it made it more productive because we spent 2.5 years getting something that looked like consensus that we might be able to move forward from, and then it became the business plan was accepted at BSI. It became a proper work item. Had a content developer allocated, and we've had various content developers from BSI. I must say they have all been astonishingly good. We would never have got near to the end without their patience and knowledge to move us forward. But then we set a timetable which people said was too optimistic of basically 20 months to complete, a year to have a draft, and then 8 months to resolve any comments. And I don't think we could have done that if we hadn't met online. So strangely, having to meet online did give it a lot more momentum. And I think because we had the momentum, we reached a point probably 6 months ago when we started into the comments resolution, where there was quite a sudden change that people could see an end, and that they weren't looking back and saying, well, this is how it is, this is how it's always been. They could see we were going to have a new draft, and it was going to be published on the 27th of August, I think it is. And we could look forward. So instead of looking back, we would look forward and say, what do we need to do in order to get this bit resolved to the next stage? And suddenly it was a really positive attitude that the desire was to complete, still to defend your product groups and to do the best and to get the best practice and not to disadvantage your product, which is absolutely right. We shouldn't do that. But seeing that we could move forward and we could reach that endpoint. And in the kind of very last drafts, as it was just coming to an end, you could see people, we were down to some, where you'd said fundamental, we won't go to this. Now they were looking at details. They were comparing two tables and say, well, these don't say quite the same thing. And really down to detail to make it the best possible standard that it could be. I'm sure it will still have one or two holes in it because it's very complicated. It's 100 pages of very technical information. But I think having that momentum, we got going and people carried on.
And I suppose because, I mean, like any standard, it's reviewed every 2 to 5 years. So there's always a chance, there will always be opportunities to make improvements. But I suppose you've now sort of won over the participants in that sense and developed that consensus and a way of working. So the chance then to make those improvements is there. I just wonder, Tim, in terms of the standards, the area of standards in which you work, do you think the way you've done this, you managed to create that consensus and resolve those challenges between sort of key industry players going online? What impact will this have for future standards making in your area?
I can't. I mean, people. It's nice to meet. It's nice to meet face to face, but. I think that will become the exception, and I think people can. We're already planning part 102, which is the installation part, and I can't see any reason not to do much of it online, because you can. If somebody can give a day, but they're going to spend 3 hours driving there and 3 hours driving back and 3 hours in the meeting, if you can ask them to give 7 hours online, you get 2 or 3 times as much work done. You have to have breaks and have to run away and to a quiet place when it all gets very frustrating. But I think it will change it, and I would hope it might shorten the process, because if you can complete a standard in 2 to 3 years instead of 10 years, that's got to be good. It's got to be good for the industry.
So, Tim, if we were to sort of circle back to the standard itself, I'm interested in sort of, if you were to sort of point at it, what do you think was the key determining factor here to really sort of kickstart the consensus development process? You've talked about, sort of it really started again sort of 4 years ago. At the heart, what was the heart of the issue here? What sort of kickstarted the process again?
I think it was the desire of the end users, the landscape architects, the road builders, transport people, that they needed the standard, and they were willing not only to kind of say we need a standard, but to join the working group and then the panel, the drafting panel, and maintain that contribution right through. So they didn't just say we need a standard, go away and write it for us. They joined in and they were at every meeting, and they were not overwhelmed to say, this is not right. This doesn't work for us. We can't follow this. And at every stage, they were critical friends, really. They were very positive. They wanted the standard. They wanted to see it done, but they were willing to challenge and to contribute. And once people could see that this was happening, then there were definite questions which needed to be resolved. People grew to understand each other and where they were coming from, and what they needed to hang on to, what was important for their products and their industry to make it successful. But they could see, well, here's a question related to the surface course of the design. The end user needs this. How can we do this, and how can we do it for all of the products so that we all have an equal chance to go forward? So I guess the challenges from the end users broke down the questions into manageable sub-questions, so that you could resolve them, get consensus on one small question, and then if you get consensus on 10 small questions, then suddenly you've solved and got consensus on a big question. And if you go on chipping away for long enough, you get consensus from everyone overall. And having that momentum of being able to meet quite often online meant that people could actually see they were progressing, even if it was in quite small increments, that they could see they were moving forward.
Our thanks to Richard Scrivener, Tim Yates and BSI's Gavin Jones for their contributions to this episode. To find out more about how you can help shape the world through standards, including pavements, go to bsigroup.com/get involved.
You have been listening to an episode of the BSI Education Podcast. Subscribe to us now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.